In a court where power was everything, the most dangerous man was the one who didn't seem to have any. The chamber stretched wider than a football field, its polished obsidian floor reflecting columns of cold violet light that hummed softly with contained energy, each pulse measured and precise like the heartbeat of a machine that had never known error, and at the center of that vast, suffocating symmetry stood Ethan Cole, alone, unarmed, and completely out of place. His dark jacket still dusted with residue from a transport bay that smelled faintly of burned circuits and recycled air, a civilian among nobles who wore authority like armor, their garments layered with metallic threads that shimmered under the overhead luminance, eyes narrowing not in curiosity but in quiet, unanimous dismissal, because in this place, worth was announced before you ever spoke, and Ethan Cole had announced nothing at all. The air carried whispers that didn't bother lowering themselves to silence. Laughter that wasn't loud but sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum of the chamber, the kind of laughter reserved for something that didn't belong, and still, he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't try to defend himself, his gaze drifting instead toward the far end of the hall where the elevated dais rose in smooth, seamless steps, each edge illuminated by thin bands of light, and at the top, seated with the stillness of something far beyond human impatience, was Empress Lyra Vera. Her presence so controlled it felt engineered, her skin a luminous shade of deep blue that caught and held the light rather than reflecting it, her posture perfectly aligned as if even gravity obeyed her differently, and though the court spoke freely, she did not. Her silence was not absence but weight, pressing down on every word spoken beneath her, and somewhere behind Ethan, a voice finally rose above the murmurs, amused, dismissive, asking how a man without rank, without clearance, without even a proper insignia, had managed to step onto a floor reserved for those who govern systems, not repaired them. Another voice followed, softer but colder, suggesting that perhaps this was a test in itself. How long the outsider would last before realizing his mistake, but Ethan didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them, his attention drawn instead to the structure behind the throne, a towering interface embedded into the wall, its surface layered with shifting patterns of light and data, streams of symbols cascading like digital rain. But something was off, the rhythm wasn't right. The timing staggered in intervals that suggested instability beneath the polished exterior, and that was the moment his eyes sharpened, not with fear, but with focus, because whatever this court believed it was watching, Ethan Cole wasn't here for them. He stepped forward, one measured pace, the sound of his boots echoing just enough to interrupt the background noise, and that alone was enough to draw sharper attention, the laughter thinning into curiosity edged with irritation, because now he was moving without permission, and in this place, that mattered more than intention. A guard shifted near the edge of the dais, posture tightening, awaiting a command that hadn't yet come, and still, above them all, the Empress remained motionless, her gaze now fixed on the man who should have been invisible but wasn't, and for the first time since he entered, Ethan spoke, his voice steady, low, not raised to compete with the room but clear enough to carry. "You built it to last forever," he said, eyes still on the unstable system behind her. "But no one planned for what happens when it finally starts to fail." And the chamber went quiet, not because they believed him, but because no one had ever spoken like that here, not to them, not in front of her, and certainly not without fear, and yet, Ethan Cole stood there as if fear had simply never been part of the design. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like pressure redistributing across a sealed chamber, the murmurs collapsing inward as if the room itself had decided to listen, and for a fraction of a second, no one moved, not the guards positioned along the perimeter with their polished armor catching the ambient glow, not the council members seated in tiers that curved around the central floor, and certainly not Ethan Cole, who stood with the same quiet stillness as before, his eyes fixed on the cascading streams of data embedded into the wall behind the throne, the flicker there now unmistakable once seen, a subtle delay between pulses, a hesitation in the system's rhythm that should have been impossible in something designed to operate with absolute precision, and yet it was there, repeating every few seconds like a flaw trying to hide inside perfection. A voice finally cut through the stillness, sharper now, less amused and more irritated, demanding how a civilian with no clearance could claim knowledge of imperial infrastructure. The words carried the weight of rank, of someone used to being obeyed without question, but Ethan did not turn to face it, did not acknowledge the authority behind it. His attention remained exactly where it had been, as if the voices behind him were background noise rather than commands. And that alone was enough to tighten the atmosphere again, because in this place, ignoring power was more offensive than challenging it. A second voice joined, colder, suggesting that perhaps the human did not understand the consequences of speaking out of turn, that this system had been stable for over 300 standard cycles, monitored continuously by minds far more advanced than his own, and the implication hung there, heavy and deliberate, that whatever he thought he saw was either ignorance or arrogance. But Ethan exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, and then stepped forward again, one more pace, bringing him closer to the base of the dais where the light intensified and the hum deepened into something that could be felt more than heard, a vibration running through the floor, up through the structure, into the bones, and now the guards shifted more visibly, not yet acting but no longer passive, their attention fixed, awaiting a signal that still had not come, and above them all, the Empress watched, her expression unchanged, but her focus absolute, her eyes tracking not the crowd, not the offended officials, but the human who continued to move without permission, without hesitation, and without any visible concern for the consequences that should have stopped him. Ethan raised his hand slightly, not in a gesture of authority but in concentration, as if aligning his thoughts with the patterns he was observing, and then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if he were speaking to the system itself rather than the room. "It is not failing everywhere," he said, his voice steady, measured, "just one segment," repeating at an interval that no one notices because it resets before the error compounds. A faint ripple passed through the chamber, not agreement, but uncertainty, because what he described was specific, precise, and uncomfortably plausible. One of the council members leaned forward, their posture shifting from dismissal to reluctant attention, asking what exactly he was implying, and Ethan finally glanced back, not fully turning, just enough for his voice to carry more directly. "I am saying you built something that corrects itself so well that it learned how to hide its own weakness." The words settled into the air with a weight that the earlier laughter could not erase, and for the first time, the system behind the throne flickered again, just slightly, just long enough for more than one set of eyes to catch it, and that was when the room changed, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that the certainty that had filled it moments ago no longer felt as solid, and in that narrowing gap between confidence and doubt, the Empress shifted, not rising, not speaking, just a subtle adjustment of posture, a fraction of movement that carried more authority than any command, and the guards froze in place, the council fell silent, and the entire court seemed to wait, not for permission, but for what she would do next. No one gave the order, but the space around Ethan Cole tightened as if it had, the kind of invisible boundary that formed when expectation hardened into something almost physical, and still, he did not step back, did not ask for permission, because by now he understood something the others did not, that the system behind the throne was not just decoration, not just a symbol of authority, it was the authority, a network older than anyone in the room, layered and refined across generations until it no longer needed to be questioned, only trusted, and that was exactly why no one had seen the flaw. Ethan moved closer to the interface, the light now bright enough to cast sharp reflections across his face, lines of shifting symbols running across his eyes like a language he did not speak but somehow understood in structure, in rhythm, in the way patterns repeated and then broke, and behind him, a council member rose from their seat, their voice no longer amused but edged with warning, stating clearly that one more step without authorization would be considered a breach of protocol. The words carried weight, reinforced by the subtle repositioning of the guards, their stance no longer passive observation but readiness, yet the command they were waiting for still had not come, and that absence was louder than anything spoken. Ethan paused, just for a moment, not because of the threat, but because he had reached the threshold where observation became action, his hand hovering inches from the interface, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from its surface, a steady, controlled heat that masked the instability beneath, and then, finally, a voice that had not spoken until now entered the space, calm, precise, impossible to ignore. "Continue." The single word came from the Empress, and it did not echo, it did not need to, because every system in the room seemed to align around it. The guards relaxed without moving, the council fell silent without being told, and the tension shifted from resistance to anticipation. Ethan did not look back, did not acknowledge the permission, but something in his posture changed, not confidence, not relief, just alignment, as if the last variable had settled into place, and then he touched the interface. the response was immediate but controlled, the surface beneath his fingers shifting, data streams reconfiguring to accommodate an input that had not been scheduled, a ripple moving through the system like a breath drawn too sharply, and for a fraction of a second, the lights dimmed, not a failure, but a recalibration, the kind that only happened when something unexpected forced the system to reconsider its own parameters, a quiet murmur spread through the chamber, not panic, not yet, but recognition that something real was happening now, something beyond protocol and beyond ceremony. Ethan's hand moved with deliberate precision, not fast, not hesitant, each adjustment calculated, each input minimal but exact, as if he were not trying to control the system but to listen to it, to guide it back into alignment rather than forcing it into compliance, and as he worked, the flicker that had once appeared every few seconds began to shift, not disappearing, but changing, stretching, revealing itself more clearly now that it was being engaged instead of ignored. The error pattern unfolded like something waking up, no longer hidden by automatic corrections, and for the first time, it became visible to everyone, a distortion in the rhythm, small but undeniable, and behind him, one of the senior advisors spoke again, their voice lower now, less certain, asking what exactly he was doing, and Ethan answered without turning, his focus never leaving the interface. "I am giving it a chance to fail," he said, and the words landed differently this time, not as defiance, but as explanation, because in a system that had been designed to prevent failure at all costs, the idea of allowing it, even briefly, felt like breaking a rule no one had ever questioned, and yet, as the pattern stabilized into something clearer, something understandable, it became obvious that this was not destruction, it was exposure, and above them all. The Empress watched, not the system, not the advisors, but the human who had just done the one thing none of them had considered, and for the first time, something shifted in her gaze, not emotion, not yet, but recognition, the kind that came when something unfamiliar finally made sense. The system did not resist him, it adjusted, like something long accustomed to perfection suddenly confronted with the unfamiliar sensation of being questioned, and the light beneath Ethan Cole's hand shifted from steady brilliance to something more dynamic, pulses stretching and compressing as if the machine itself was trying to understand what it was being asked to reveal. The chamber responded in kind, the ambient hum deepening into a low resonance that vibrated through the floor and up into the towering columns, a subtle but undeniable reminder that this was not just a display, it was infrastructure, it was control, it was the foundation beneath everything they believed was stable, and now it was changing in front of them. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as the exposed pattern began to unfold in greater detail, the error no longer hidden behind automated correction cycles but visible as a repeating cascade, each loop building on the last, a delay of less than a fraction of a second that compounded over time, small enough to ignore in isolation but dangerous when left unaddressed, and behind him, the silence of the court had transformed into something heavier, not confusion, not fear, but the uneasy realization that something they had trusted without question might not be as flawless as they believed. One of the senior advisors finally stepped forward, their voice controlled but strained, asking if the human understood the magnitude of what he was interfering with, reminding him that this system governed energy distribution across entire sectors, that even a minor disruption could ripple outward in ways that could not be easily contained. The words were measured, careful, but they carried an undercurrent of urgency that had not been present before, and Ethan listened, truly listened, not dismissing the warning but absorbing it, and then he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he understood the risk, before speaking again, his voice calm, grounded. "That is exactly why it cannot keep hiding this," he said, his fingers moving again across the interface, not pressing, not forcing, but guiding, introducing a controlled delay into the system's response cycle, a deliberate pause where there had once been immediate correction, and the effect was immediate. The pattern expanded, the hidden flaw surfacing fully now, no longer a flicker but a visible distortion in the flow of data, a hesitation that spread across the interface like a ripple moving through still water. The lights in the chamber dimmed by a fraction, not enough to alarm, but enough to be noticed, enough to remind everyone present that what was happening here was real, that the system they depended on was reacting, adapting, and for the first time in a very long time, uncertain. The guards did not move, the advisors did not interrupt, because now they were watching, truly watching, not the human, but the system, and what it was becoming under his touch. Ethan's breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. But there was a focus in him now that was unmistakable, the kind of focus that came not from confidence, but from responsibility, because he knew what he was doing, not in theory, but in consequence, and that understanding shaped every movement, every adjustment. He was not trying to prove anything, he was trying to prevent something, and that difference was what set him apart from everyone else in the room. Above him, on the elevated dais, the Empress remained seated, but her stillness had shifted. It was no longer passive observation, it was engagement, her gaze tracking every change in the system, every subtle reaction to Ethan's input, and when the distortion finally stabilized into a clear, repeating anomaly, something that could no longer be dismissed or ignored, she rose, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a measured motion that carried absolute authority, and the moment she stood, the chamber responded, not with sound, but with silence, complete and total, every eye turning toward her, every breath held, because in that single movement, the question was no longer whether the human was right, it was what she would decide to do about it. When the Empress stood, the system responded before anyone else did, the ambient light recalibrating in subtle gradients that followed her movement, as if even the architecture recognized the shift in authority, and for a moment, nothing else changed, no commands were issued, no voices rose, but the entire chamber seemed to hold itself in suspension, waiting for something that had not yet been spoken. Ethan Cole did not turn to face her, not immediately, because the system still had his attention, the exposed anomaly continuing its steady, imperfect rhythm across the interface, no longer hidden. No longer corrected, just present, honest in a way that perfection never was, and he knew better than to abandon it now, not when it was finally understood. Behind him, the advisors remained still, their earlier confidence replaced with a careful silence, the kind that came when certainty had been replaced by something less comfortable, and yet no one interrupted, because the Empress had not spoken, and until she did, nothing else in the room carried more weight than her silence. She descended the steps of the dais slowly, each movement measured, the light beneath her feet adjusting with precision, not illuminating her path, but aligning with it, as if the system itself acknowledged her presence as part of its design. Her gaze remained fixed on Ethan, not the system, not the advisors, but the one person who had changed the balance of the room without permission, and when she reached the base of the dais, she stopped, not close enough to intrude, but close enough that her presence could no longer be ignored. Ethan felt it then, not pressure, not intimidation, but awareness, the kind that sharpened everything around it, and only then did he step back from the interface, not in retreat, but in completion, his hand lowering slowly as the system stabilized into its new, exposed state, the distortion still present but no longer expanding, contained within the parameters he had introduced, controlled, understood, and for the first time since he had entered the chamber, he turned to face her fully. The difference in scale between them was unmistakable, not just in height, but in presence, in the way the space seemed to respond to her existence. But Ethan did not lower his gaze, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing in him that suggested he should. The silence stretched for another second, maybe two, long enough for every person in the chamber to feel the weight of it, and then she spoke, her voice even, precise, carrying without force, "You altered a system that has remained unchanged for generations," she said, not as an accusation, not as praise, simply as fact. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it. "It was already changing," he replied, his voice just as steady. "You just were not seeing it." A subtle shift passed through the advisors behind him, not disagreement, but discomfort, because the statement was not wrong, it was simply something they had never considered. The Empress regarded him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, but her focus unwavering. "And now that we see it," she continued, "what would you have us do?" The question did not sound like a challenge, it sounded like evaluation, as if the next words mattered more than anything that had come before. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes drifting briefly back to the interface, to the pattern he had revealed, the flaw that was no longer hidden, and then back to her. "Do not fix it the way you always have," he said, "do not hide it again." A faint flicker of reaction moved through the chamber, because that was not the answer they expected, not the answer they wanted. But Ethan continued before anyone could interrupt, "Let it run like this for a while," he added, "let it show you where it breaks, not just where it corrects, because right now, you only trust what it hides." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the idea itself felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, and yet it made a kind of sense that could not be easily dismissed, and the Empress stood there, looking at him, not as a subject, not as an intruder, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit into the structure she had inherited, and in that moment, the decision she was about to make began to take shape, not in words, but in understanding. No one expected the answer to be accepted, not like that, not without resistance, because what Ethan Cole had just suggested was not a repair, it was a risk, and this court had not been built on risk, it had been built on control, on systems that corrected themselves before failure could ever be seen, on the idea that perfection was not just possible but required. And yet now that perfection had been shown to be incomplete, the silence that followed his words carried something new, not just doubt, but consideration, the kind that spread slowly, reluctantly, through minds trained to reject uncertainty. One of the senior advisors finally stepped forward again, their voice measured but firm, stating that allowing instability to persist, even in a controlled state, would be irresponsible, that the system governed energy distribution across entire regions, that even a minor deviation could introduce inefficiencies that would ripple outward, affecting millions who depended on its consistency. The argument was logical, structured, exactly what the court expected, and for a moment, it felt like the room might return to its old balance, to the comfort of established reasoning, but Ethan did not interrupt, did not argue, he simply listened, and when the advisor finished, he nodded once, acknowledging the concern. "You are right," he said, his voice calm, without resistance, and that alone caused a subtle shift, because agreement was not what they expected from him. "It is inefficient," he continued, "but it is honest." The word settled into the space like something unfamiliar, something that did not belong in discussions of systems and control, and yet it lingered, because it described something the others had not considered. The advisor frowned slightly, as if trying to place the value of that concept within their framework, but before they could respond, the Empress spoke again, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "If we allow this," she said, her gaze still on Ethan, "we accept a system that is less stable than before." It was not a question, it was a statement of consequence, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "No," he replied, "you accept a system you actually understand." The difference was subtle, but it mattered, and for the first time, a faint shift moved through her expression, not emotion, not yet, but recognition of the distinction. Because stability without understanding was not control, it was assumption, and assumption was something no ruler could afford. The chamber remained silent, not because there were no objections left, but because none of them carried more weight than the exchange happening at the center of the room, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Empress turned her attention away from Ethan and toward the interface, her gaze tracing the exposed pattern, the distortion that now pulsed openly within the system, visible, measurable, undeniable. She studied it not as a flaw, but as information, as something that could be learned from rather than hidden, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but decision. "Maintain the current state," she said, and the words moved through the chamber like a quiet shockwave, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The advisors stiffened slightly, the guards remained still, and the system continued its steady, imperfect rhythm, because in that moment, the rule had changed, not through force, not through correction, but through choice, and Ethan Cole stood there, no longer just an outsider in the wrong place, but the reason that place had just become something different, something less certain, and somehow, more real. The decision did not echo, but its effect spread through the chamber with unmistakable clarity, like a recalibration that no one had prepared for, because in a court defined by certainty, the choice to allow imperfection was not just unusual, it was disruptive, not in action, but in principle, and that was where the true tension began to rise, not from the system behind the throne, but from the people standing beneath it. The advisors exchanged brief glances, subtle, controlled, but loaded with meaning, because they understood what this meant beyond the immediate moment. It was not just about one anomaly, it was about precedent, about what it meant for a system to be allowed to show weakness instead of conceal it. One of them stepped forward again, more carefully this time, their tone respectful but firm, suggesting that perhaps a temporary observation period could be established under strict supervision, that the system could be monitored externally while internal corrections remained active, a compromise designed to preserve both control and caution. It was a logical proposal, balanced, safe, exactly the kind of solution the court had always relied on, but before the suggestion could fully settle, the Empress spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that left no space for reinterpretation. "No," she said, and the single word carried more weight than any argument that had come before it, because it did not reject the idea of caution, it rejected the instinct to control what had already been revealed. The advisor inclined their head slightly, acknowledging the response, but the hesitation remained. Not defiance, not disobedience, just the quiet resistance of someone adjusting to a shift they did not initiate, and in the center of it all, Ethan Cole remained still, no longer interacting with the interface, no longer moving, because his part in this moment had already been completed. The system continued its steady, imperfect rhythm behind him, the anomaly now part of its visible structure, not hidden, not corrected, just present, and the room had begun to adjust to it. Not fully, not comfortably, but enough that it was no longer ignored, and that alone was a transformation. The Empress turned slightly, her attention moving from the system to the advisors, then back to Ethan, as if measuring not just the outcome, but the source of it. "You will remain," she said, her voice directed at him now, not as an order given to a subject, but as a decision made with intent, "to observe what you have uncovered." The phrasing was precise, deliberate, it did not elevate him. It did not diminish him, it simply placed him within the process he had initiated, and for a moment, the weight of that settled over the chamber, because this was not recognition in the traditional sense, it was something else, something quieter but no less significant. Ethan nodded once, not in gratitude, not in surprise, just acknowledgement, because to him, this was not a reward, it was continuation, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The advisors watched him now with a different kind of attention, not dismissive, not amused, but analytical, trying to understand what made him operate the way he did, what allowed him to step into a system he did not control and see something they had missed, and more importantly, why he had not used that moment to claim anything for himself. The Empress observed that as well, the absence of expectation, the lack of ambition in the traditional sense, and in that absence, she recognized something that did not align with the structures she had been raised to uphold, something that did not seek power, and therefore could not be easily defined by it. And as the chamber slowly resumed its controlled stillness, as the system continued its exposed rhythm, as the court adjusted to a new kind of awareness, the shift that had begun with a single step forward had not ended, it had only deepened, because now the question was no longer whether the system could fail, it was what would happen next, now that someone had chosen to see it. The chamber did not return to what it had been, it could not, because once something hidden had been seen, it changed the way everything else was understood, and now the system behind the throne continued its steady, imperfect rhythm, no longer a flawless construct but a living process, something that revealed as much as it concealed, and that alone had altered the balance of the room. The advisors no longer spoke with the same certainty. Their voices, when they came, were quieter, more deliberate, shaped by the awareness that what they had once considered complete might only have been incomplete in ways they had never measured, and Ethan Cole stood where he had been asked to remain, not elevated, not removed, simply present, his attention divided between the system and the subtle shifts unfolding around him, because the real change was no longer in the interface, it was in the people observing it. One of the junior analysts stepped forward cautiously, their hesitation visible in the careful way they approached the edge of the central floor, requesting permission to review the exposed pattern more closely, their tone respectful but edged with something new, not fear, but curiosity, and the Empress gave a slight inclination of her head, a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the way the entire chamber responded to it. The analyst moved quickly then, accessing a secondary console, their hands moving with practiced precision as they mirrored the anomaly across a localized display, isolating it, studying it, and for the first time, the system was not just being observed as a whole, it was being examined in parts, understood through its imperfections rather than in spite of them. The data unfolded differently when approached this way, layers that had once been smoothed over now revealed subtle interactions, delays that interacted with one another in ways that had gone unnoticed before, and as the analyst worked, others began to follow, not rushing, not abandoning protocol, but adjusting it, adapting their roles to accommodate a new kind of observation, and the chamber filled not with noise, but with focused activity, quiet, deliberate, purposeful, a shift from performance to process, and through it all, the Empress remained still, her attention moving between the system, her advisors, and Ethan, measuring not just what was happening, but what it meant. Because this was no longer about a single flaw, it was about a different way of seeing, a different way of governing, one that did not rely solely on control, but on understanding, and that distinction carried implications far beyond the chamber. Ethan felt it too, not as pressure, but as awareness, the recognition that what he had done had extended beyond the technical, that it had introduced something into this place that had not existed before, and yet he did not step forward, did not claim a role in what was unfolding. He remained where he was, observing, because that was what he had been asked to do, and more importantly, it was what the system required now, not intervention, but attention. The anomaly continued its steady pulse, no longer threatening, no longer hidden, simply present, a constant reminder that perfection was not the same as truth, and as the chamber adjusted, as the court shifted from certainty to something more complex, the Empress finally turned her gaze fully toward Ethan once more, her expression unchanged, but her understanding no longer the same, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them, not agreement, not approval, but recognition, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood, because in a place built on power. The most significant change had not come from force, but from the willingness to see what had always been there. Nothing returned to silence, not completely, because something had changed too deeply to be undone, and the system behind the throne continued its steady, imperfect rhythm, no longer an unnoticed background but a presence that everyone in the chamber now felt, measured, and understood in a way they had not before. The analysts remained at their stations, their movements precise and deliberate, no longer correcting, no longer smoothing, but observing, recording, learning, and each cycle of the anomaly revealed something new, not failure, but behavior, a pattern that could be studied rather than erased, and that shift, quiet as it was, had redefined the purpose of the system itself. Ethan Cole stood where he had been placed, neither central nor dismissed, simply present within the unfolding process, his gaze occasionally lifting from the interface to the people now adapting around it. Because what mattered was not just what the system showed, but how they chose to respond to it, and that response was changing, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. The advisors who once spoke in certainty now asked questions, not out of weakness, but out of recognition that understanding required it, and even the guards, unmoving at the edges of the chamber, carried a different stillness, not just discipline, but awareness, as if they too understood that something fundamental had shifted, and above it all, the Empress remained the fixed point, her presence unchanged in form, but altered in perception, because now she did not stand above a perfect system. She stood before one that revealed its own limits, and in that revelation, her authority was no longer defined by control alone, but by what she chose to do with that truth. She stepped forward once more, not toward the system, but toward Ethan, closing the distance that had remained between them since the beginning, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision as before, but with a depth that had not been there. When the court first began, you saw what others did not, she said, not as praise, not as judgment, simply as fact. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, because for him, this had never been about recognition, it was always there, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer held more weight than anything more elaborate could have, because it meant that the difference had never been in the system, it had been in the willingness to look at it without assumption. The Empress studied him for a moment longer, and then, without turning to the advisors, without addressing the court, she made her final decision, not through proclamation, not through ceremony, but through a shift in how she spoke. You will not return to where you came from, she said, and the words did not carry command so much as certainty. You will remain here, not as an outsider, but as a constant observer of what others choose not to see. The chamber absorbed the statement in silence. Because this was not elevation in the traditional sense, it was something more precise, more deliberate. It was a role defined not by rank, but by purpose, and that made it something entirely new. Ethan did not react with surprise, did not question, he simply nodded once, because in that moment, he understood that this was not about him, it was about what had begun here, what would continue long after this moment passed. The system pulsed behind them, steady, imperfect, honest, and for the first time, it was not something hidden behind authority, it was something acknowledged by it. The Empress turned slightly then, her gaze moving across the chamber, across the advisors, the analysts, the guards, and finally back to the system itself, and in that quiet, measured stillness, the meaning of her decision settled into the space, not as an order, but as a shift in how things would be seen from this point forward, because in a place built on power, the greatest change had not come from strength, but from the simple act of noticing, and the willingness to let that truth remain.